Dear audience, welcome to this online event here at the Danish Foreign Policy Society. My name is Charlotte Flindt Pedersen. I'm the director of the Danish Foreign Policy Society, and I'm the host of today's meeting. First, I'm so very pleased to welcome Walter Slocombe, who is on the board of directors of the Atlantic Council. He's member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was Under Secretary of Defense for Policy during President Clinton. And he was also the senior advisor for security and defense to the coalition provisional authority in Baghdad. So Walter Slocombe will talk for approximately 20 minutes, and he'll speak about US foreign and security policy. What is to expect in regards to NATO, Russia, China, and other issues? Will the US position in the global arena change with a new president? And if so, in which way? And how will this affect the security of other nations? And what are actually the prospects for action on climate change in the future? Well, first of all, I had a small presentation of you before you came on, but just to say that we were planning to have you here a month ago in Denmark, and the topic was totally different. The topic was on nuclear disarmament and how is everything going on this. But the world has changed a lot since then. So we're extremely happy to have you to speak about the US foreign policy, also in view of the upcoming presidential elections. So be my guest, 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards.
Why don't you tell me when I'm at about 18 minutes?
Okay.
Should I just start?
Yeah, I do just start.
Okay. First of all, it's an honor to be here. I apologize for the delay in the connection, but it's still sort of amazing it works. It's an honor to be asked to do this. This election is going to be basically a referendum on Donald Trump. Biden is, I think, and so lots of other people, very well suited for the presidency, but in an important sense, his most attractive characteristic is that he is not Donald Trump. And he is thought to have the best chance of beating him. I make no claim to neutrality in this election, but I will try to give a fair description of the views and what it's reasonable to expect, both in the campaign about foreign policy and subsequent to the election, depending very much on how it comes out. Foreign policy as such is not going to be a major issue. It very seldom is. It probably never should be in a reasonably stable democracy that's not in the middle of a disastrous war. But this year, there's one very important qualification to that, and that has to do with China. Just 2 months ago, Trump thought he had, and he may well have had, an ideal strategy for re-election, which was essentially to run on a good, not spectacular, but genuinely good economy. The onslaught of the virus has obliterated that plan, and he's come up with a new one. Of course, he will continue to say the economy is in great shape and coming back fast. But he's added to this a whole new element. He will blame China for both the virus and its economic effects in an effort to deflect onto China criticisms of his own record with respect to the pandemic. And he has already, consistent with this strategy, begun proclaiming that China desperately wants him to be defeated. I'll come to more general issues about the US-China relationship, but the key starting point is that Trump intends to make China a central issue. Otherwise, foreign policy is not a big issue. The big issues are, as in most democracies, domestic ones: healthcare, immigration, climate change, the rights of women, LGBT people, religious people, guns, education, inequality, wealth, and income. And in a more general sense, a concern about US institutions and the direction the country is headed. Now, I think it's important to have some background on the character of American politics in this context. Trump is a deeply divisive figure, but he is more a reflection of the deep polarization in American society than the cause of it. America is changing, in some ways remarkably fast. It's becoming less white, less native born, less uniformly Christian, more unequal in wealth, deeply divided in geographic and day-to-day life terms, and profoundly split on values and the still developing social and cultural change of the last 50 years. The result is that the parties are very different. The Republican Party is overwhelmingly white, Christian, church-going, married, male, straight, older, this may change, small town or rural, Western and Southern, not coastal, middle income, or very wealthy, and with high school and some college, neither more or less as education. The Democratic Party is essentially everybody else. Black, Hispanic, Asian, Jewish, secular, female, especially single women, especially young single women, younger people, LGBT people, people who live in big cities and college towns, mostly near the coast. Both people, interestingly enough, both people with very low income and the level of income comfortably off, but not fabulously wealthy professionals. These two Americas not only vote, but they live increasingly in separate information, social, and geographic worlds. Too many people in one group find it genuinely hard to understand how anyone can be in the other. And their respective numbers, difficult to measure, but pretty even. I certainly don't intend to predict the results. All you can say is that now Biden holds a small but significant lead, but it's very early, and the outcome could go either way. And as you know, it doesn't matter what the popular majority is, it's who wins a handful of battleground states because of the way the Electoral College works. And there are probably some 8, maybe 10 out of the 50 states in which there's any doubt, any serious doubt about the result, barring a landslide one way or the other. But either Donald Trump or Joe Biden, barring some surprise, and I guess this year you always have to say it's possible there will be a surprise, will be president of the United States. Out of 350 odd Americans, 350 million odd Americans, only those two people have a reasonable chance. That makes it terribly important for foreign policy, because foreign policy in the United States is determined to an extraordinary extent by the president personally and unilaterally, much more than is in the case for domestic policy in the United States, or indeed for foreign policy in most parliamentary democracies. As one of my mentors in the national security business once told me, every 4 years, the United States elects a dictator for foreign policy. There is an important limit, of course, even on an American president, about foreign policy, which is that the outside world plays a role, surprises can come up. And of course, we can never be sure how the winner will in fact behave in office. The office itself, in most cases, not this one, but in most cases, the office itself and the pressure of events and of decisions can change its occupant and can change the matters with which he has to deal. So let's begin with Trump. Trump's views are now well known, although often so rapidly changing as to be baffling, but we can say some things for certain. The elements of his foreign policy views include, first of all, America first, especially on trade, which in his mind is mostly useful to the degree other countries buy American goods. A deep distrust of foreign nations, foreigners, alliances, and multilateral institutions, and of international agreements, including arms control and multilateral trade. Related to this, a conviction that the United States has been taken advantage of by foreigners, not only on trade, but on defense spending and a variety of other issues. A disapproval of immigration and immigrants, a disdain and distrust of the leaders of other democracies, who he correctly suspects haven't got much use for him. But at the same time, a fascination with authoritarian strongmen, from Putin to Netanyahu. It seems a paradox, but it is consistent with his personality, his narcissism, his solipsism, his insecurity, and possibly a reflection of a self-identification with them as tough, ruthless, blunt-talking, macho men, disrespected by established elites, and able to appeal to a common people. He also has a real estate developer's worldview of a world in which there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. Everything is transactional, and everything can be settled at the level of principles, and price in money terms is really the only thing worth talking. He has a fondness for big gestures and an indifference to implementation. He talks, his rhetoric is full of bluster and saber rattling, but in fact, to be fair to him, over the past 3 years, he has been remarkably reluctant to do things which would escalate a conflict or continue, and much from his point of view, much worse, increase American commitment to conflict. He has a distrust of experts, of facts, of science, and in terms of personality, has a preference for family, people of unquestioned loyalty, and a low tolerance for those who disagree or confront him with unwelcome facts, or particularly, to some degree, like all presidents, like the argument that that's not how it's always been done. So far, much of the day-to-day foreign policy of the country in the last 3 years has been pretty conventional. And some of those, and some of even the controversial elements in Trump's foreign policy are not new. The United States has been badgering allies about not spending enough on defense since the Lisbon Force goals in 1949. And getting countries to pay more host nation support. We've taken actions without real consultation. We've pressured Iran. We've complained about trade imbalances and unfair trade practices. And we've regarded decent relations with adversaries as on the whole a good thing. The Chinese do steal technology. Trade relations are always to some degree transactional. And our record in Middle Eastern conflicts in particular is far from a success. However, the pattern of the last 3.5 years has evolved to become much less confrontational. There's been a gradual departure of the so-called adults in the room, people like General Mattis, and a replacement by true loyalists and people highly dependent on Trump. There's every reason to believe that this pattern would extend and intensify in a second term. Now, the Democrat. Biden, by contrast, is a much less distinctive personality. That is, in some sense, both his strength and his weakness. He has a lifetime of involvement in foreign policy. He knows the issues, he knows many foreign leaders, he's genuinely interested in them. He has a respect for facts, and he has a long-term legislator's willingness to work with people who disagree with him on other issues, on particular issues where they can agree. And he has a legislative compromiser sense that a half a loaf is better than none and progress is better than no progress. He is also a very skilled politician. In my opinion, at least, his reputation for gaps, for misspeaking, is as much a side effect of his ability to engage ordinary people in terms they can understand as it is any kind of weakness. Substantively, on foreign policy, Biden, as on a good deal less, can be said to exemplify the traditional democratic post-World War II foreign policy, which was indeed the foreign policy views of the dominant national elite in both parties. Being broadly internationalist, support for strong military, for alliances, for an open market-paced international economy, a defense of democratic principles and social justice, but a willingness to work with the world as it is, and identify that there are some true adversaries as well as people you have to work with. It's all founded on a belief that fundamentally the United States has been a force for good in the world, and that the active American role in the world has been good for the United States. Now, there's some specific elements. Biden and most Democrats broadly support alliances, especially those with NATO and our major Asian partners. Standing up to Russia, broad-scale engagement in international affairs, standing up to China, American leadership, the concern for human rights, support for arms control, and non-proliferation. I think Biden and the Democrats are much more open on immigration issues, which are a funny combination of foreign policy and domestic policy. Very much will be. Climate change for the Democratic Party and for Biden personally is a high priority. It's recognized as an existential threat that must be addressed. In contrast to Trump and most Republicans, their attitude is essentially one of denial and avoidance. Any Democrat will certainly rejoin the Paris Agreement, presumably with some tinkering to save face a little bit, but there remain issues of cost, impact on economies, the distribution of responsibility among countries, and what specific measures to adopt and what other countries are prepared to do. On trade, Democratic position and Biden's position is far from an absolutist free trade, classic liberal view. But Biden recognizes the importance of trade, but there are legitimate complaints about IP theft, technology advances, protectionist standards, and not only from China. But there are also elements in US trade policy for Biden of some trade nationalism and concern that trade agreements inadequately address labor and environmental standards. Let's turn to three specific areas: China, Russia, and NATO. As for China, it will, as I said, be a major issue, but whoever wins, it will also be a major challenge. There are real issues between the United States and China. And one of Trump's tactics, indeed, will be to take actions against China prior to the election to confirm his bona fides as tough on China. There's even been crazy talk about stopping payment on the debt they hold. I don't think that'll happen. But China seeks to oust the United States as an obstacle to its hegemony in Asia and to replace the American-created economic and political and security model for Asia with one which they would dominate. China's taken a long series of actions to this end, each of which in a way will need to be addressed by the new administration. Serious military buildup, assertive operations, notably in the South China Sea, but in other places as well, alignment with Russia, seeking a role in the Arctic, trying to develop its global tech status as a major supplier, including getting a place in critical infrastructure in the West, and skillfully employing soft power, from the Belt and Road Initiative to seeking the US created vacuum of leadership, and to retaliate strongly for US tariffs with targeted tariffs and pressure on supply chains that have had the effect, should have had the effect, in reminding people that two can play at the game of the political use of tariffs. The crisis, the COVID crisis, has demonstrated the degree to which China is integrated into the global economy and the world supply chain, not just in electronics, but as we've seen dramatically in medical supplies and the like. This cuts both ways. It means the United States needs China economically more than we like to admit, but it also means that China needs access to the world and in particular the US economy as well. I think both sides recognize that a war would be a disaster, but there is always a latent threat of conflict, particularly over Taiwan, or conceivably over some incident in the South China Sea getting out of hand, rather like the P3 incident at the very beginning of the George W. Bush administration. And there are very real trade and economic issues. And there is no real evidence, none whatever, as far as I can see, that China in any sense deliberately created the COVID-19 virus. But it did spread from China. And China was a good deal less than ideally transparent in the early days, although their record is not as bad as Trump says it is. So perhaps the greatest foreign policy task of the United States and of the new president will manage an inevitably competitive relationship with China without military. The term is in disfavor, but a right U.S. policy toward China could reasonably be described as containment, which was, after all, a way of working with other countries who thought threatened by China and resisting, defending our end there, but also finding a way to live with the Soviet Union without war. And in this contest, the United States has some real advantages. Militarily, China would be a formidable adversary, but the PLA is still far behind the United States in sheer military power, and crucially, in actual combat experience. And indeed, their brief forays into combat since the revolution, since the Korean War, have not been very promising. Economically, the United States is much stronger, and China itself faces a serious problem of maintaining its growth, not only in economic terms, but because maintaining growth has been, maintaining a high level of growth has in some sense been the price, what the public get, and they get an amazing amount from economic growth in China for the retained power of the Communist Party. In short, and also China has managed to annoy a lot of countries by bullying, by very self-interested economic policies, by making promises that they don't deliver on. In short, there is a big difference between China's aspirations and its capacity to achieve them, but dealing with China will be a major issue. I would say the major issue next to climate. Russia is arguably a more important but less critical challenge than China. There is a very broad consensus in the United States at the dangers we face from Russia. And indeed, we have the paradoxical situation. I never thought that I would live to see the day when the Democratic Party could plausibly be able to blame a Republican president for being soft on Moscow. Putin has done a lot to deserve his reputation. His assertive, even provocative behavior in the course of trying to restore Russia to at least some of the glories and power of the Soviet era. Crimea, the Ukraine, a very substantial military buildup, which at a very minimum has achieved local advantages in the early days of a conflict. Greater reliance on nuclear weapons in Russian doctrine, and, as with China, exploitation of soft power, of the U.S. vacuum, exploiting the U.S. vacuum and lack of leadership in Europe, and especially to appeal to authoritarian states in Europe, like Hungary, to some appalling degree Poland, and Turkey. And of course, Putin has also been prepared to use a variety of, at least ideally, from his point of view, below the level of real force, literally murdering dissidents in the West, interfering in elections in the West, a massive disinformation campaign, and to exploit America's absence or reduced presence in the Middle East. All of this in the context of, as was for a long time, Soviet efforts to divide the United States and its European allies. In general, the Trump administration has pressed back on Russia. Sanctions are enforced. There have been deployments in Europe. There is increased funding for support of deterrence initiative in some of the frontline NATO states. Some people doubt if Trump's heart is really in it and how long it would survive if Putin were to make an attractive offer. But that's where it stands now. And Russia faces real internal problems. Collapse of the and spread of the virus are as much challenges on the oil issue as to the Middle East as to any other oil producer. And Russia, like everybody else, is not immune to the virus. The new administration, particularly a Democratic administration, might well try a reset. There is one tempting target, which is the extension of the START II agreement. As you probably know, the START II agreement expires next year. It can be extended without any further negotiation by the two parties if they agree. By a curious quirk in the calendar, there is about a week after the inauguration before the nominal deadline for an extension. I think it is, let me say, not unlikely that if Trump does not extend, which he might well do, particularly if he can get some kind of flashy addition out of Putin, that Biden would at least try to get the Russians to say, look, I know the building, but I can barely find my way to the bedroom. Give me a couple of months and we'll talk about it. But a big arms control agreement is hard to foresee. Let me say briefly about Europe. It's very much linked with Russia because NATO cohesion and strength are the key to effective deterrence. The alliance in the United States retains extraordinarily broad support, far more than any other U.S. international commitment. Trump, obviously doesn't like NATO very much, is grudging support for Article 5, and if reelected, he might try to carry through on threats to withdraw, if not outright, at least to drastically reduce the American commitment as to change the nature of the alliance fundamentally. I hope, and indeed I expect, that this is one area where a combination of traditional Republicans and Democrats under the uniform military, along with public support for the alliance, would stop him or at least restrain him. But the current splits and arguments would continue, and a Biden administration would try to rebuild U.S. leadership in NATO. But there are obstacles. First of all, there's been a lot of damage done. It won't be all cured in a day. The burden sharing is likely to get worse because as European and American fiscal problems become much, much more severe because of the pandemic, there will be big pressures on defense budgets. But Biden, I think, would make it a high priority. Climate change, I think, as I said, I think potentially climate change is not only the biggest issue, and obviously it's not primarily a foreign policy issue, and it may be the one on which there is the sharpest substantive difference, as opposed to differences in tone and mode, or differences associated peculiarly with Trump's strange personality. It may be the one issue where there's the most that turns on the other. And with that, I think I made it in the allotted time. And that's a very quick run through of a very large number of issues, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Walter. I think it's very fascinating, and still, like in Denmark, we're saying, that there's not that big difference between the change in policy direction from Obama to Trump. But to me, there are some key issues that you're mentioning, which is the climate change, the way you look at but still the look towards Asia, the look towards China will be a dominating one, neither whether it's a Biden or whether it's a Trump. And I have actually a question from one of the participants who sent me a question beforehand, and it's on the South China Sea. So it's from Jan Top Christensen, who's but a Dane, and I know that he's also been writing books about foreign policy. And he asked the following question. Since the UN tribunal ruling in 2016, China has continued its militarization of the disputed isles, construction of missile launch pads and airstrips for offensive military planes. So the only symbolic freedom of navigation drills is by US, UK, Canada, and France Navy ships. And but that has not disturbed the consolidation of the China in building activities. Do you see any genuine change ahead, irrespective of who wins the presidential elections in November, as to serious US steps to prevent further Chinese military buildup in the South China Sea?
The short answer is no. I believe the United States will continue and probably intensify, I believe personally they should intensify, the freedom of navigation activities. And you rightly mentioned other countries. I think actually the Australians have done one too, at least. Try to get other Asian countries to participate. Militarily, I don't think what happens in those islands makes a whole lot of difference. Yes, sure. But China has plenty of bases in that part of the world. If it did come to a conflict, it's a target-rich environment, which actually has the advantage of not being undisputed sovereign Chinese territory. I think the critical fact has not to do with those islands. It has to do with demonstrably resisting on a multinational basis, on a regional, Britain and France are basis that we are not accepting this, continue intelligence fights, continue freedom of navigation. I personally think that there's a greater potential well, there's always a great potential for a crisis over Taiwan, which is a much more difficult issue, much more important in genuine terms. Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea is important. What they're actually doing there is not of tremendous strategic importance, and it's hard to imagine either side, except as a result of just terrible blunders, actually coming to the use of military force over the islands. It's easy to imagine that over time.
And here's a question from Søren Peirup. How do you judge the Trump-Kushner's policy in the Middle East? Any prospects of even a partial success?
No. I mean, Netanyahu is an amazing survivor. And there will be in a very short term, probably long before the election, as soon as the government is actually in place. One of the terms of the coalition agreement, blue and white, is if the United States proves, I'm not sure it says approves, but after consultation, they will go ahead with a major annexation. I'm not sure what even this administration do, because I think this issue will probably come to a head before the election, might not. That depends much more on Israeli politics, America. There is some talk of kind of telling Netanyahu, cool. And a Democratic administration. Well, Israel is a complicated issue for Democrats. Democratic Party has traditionally has been and is very supportive of Israel to a degree that no other center-left country in the world is. Committed to help maintain Israel's military superiority. A sense that some of the pro-Palestinian talk has ugly elements of anti-Semitism to it when you get there. But on the other hand, a real commitment to a two-state solution. I think the chances of an agreement any like the basis of the Cushion Plan are zero, if only because lots of better, much more realistic plans haven't worked. If the kinds of things which have been discussed in the past are not acceptable to the two parties, it's hard to see how such a one-sided deal could be. And it poses huge problems for Israel, because Israel, in some sense, and this is not all Israel's fault, Israel, in some sense, faces the choice between being a primarily Jewish democracy, or being a state in which there is a very large non-Jewish Arab Palestinian element in the population. And the choice between it not being a Jewish state or it not being a democratic state. Well, I think any democratic administration, Biden specifically, would try very hard to put together some kind of a peace plan. Unfortunately, a lot of people have tried. It's not a reason not to try again, but a lot of people have tried. And I think even a lot of Israelis. And at one point, Netanyahu said he was in favor.
Questions from Peter Harbo. Will the politics in the US maintain the level of military power and intelligence capability it has today in 5 years' time?
Oh, I think almost certainly yes. There will be pressures on the defense budget, I think. However, there is very broad support in the United States for an overwhelmingly strong military. A strong military. This is an absolutely world-class military. There are issues. The United States military has gone through a profound shift in the last few years, beginning before Trump, but continuing, shifting from terrorism and low-intensity conflicts and the aftermaths of wars in Afghanistan, the conduct of a war in the Middle East, to preparing for what the military likes to call near-peer competitors, which means Russia and China. And that will continue, and it'll force some hard choices. And I think at a minimum, it is unlikely the American defense budget will increase, may not even increase in nominal terms, much less real terms. But I think it will continue to be very, very large. And it will produce a very powerful military. The challenges are more in areas where it's hybrid warfare, cyber conflict, data manipulation, those sorts of things. It's just a hard problem, and it's not where our comparative advantage lies.
Now there's a question from Per Carlsen.
Right there.
Yeah. What can you say about differences in Democratic and Republican views on Greenland and the Arctic?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think people, with all due respect, with one exception, I think nobody took the idea of buying Greenland seriously. Because of things I've done with the Atlantic Council, I actually have had some contact with Arctic and Greenland issues. And I understand the complicated relationship between Greenland and other parts of the kingdom. But I think that will. But let's say Greenland is not likely to be a major issue in the campaign. The Arctic is a little different. It is an area which is changing rapidly. And it's interesting, it's one of the few places where you can identify real tensions between Russia and China. Because the Russians, one of the legitimate claims the Russians make to a special status in them is that they are a very, very factor in the Arctic. Like that, just because the Chinese have ships, they're in some sense an associated Arctic state. Global warming obviously makes Arctic issues change very rapidly and much more profound. I think the United States will continue to have an increasing interest in the Arctic. It is, after all, joins an American state, and its military significance is. And I think the United States has very much supported the efforts of some countries in NATO to give much more attention to the security issues that arise in the Arctic. And it exemplifies the problem of coexistence. Norway and indeed Denmark, because have had to find a way to protect their interests and yet recognize, first of all, there are some important common interests, and that the last thing anybody wants is a real major confrontation, much less a conflict over the Earth.
Now there's a question from Hannibal Vel. Is there a way for the US to effectively confront China without the support and coordination with its close allies?
Well, the short answer is no. That's why, well, I think that's the one clear mistake that the Trump administration has made with respect to China. Many of the things that we as a country, complain about are real problems. I mean, the Chinese do steal technology. They do subsidize industry. They are trying very much to win influence and so on in neighboring countries. I think the big mistake has been that we weaken our most important advantage next, maybe to military, which is we have real allies. Some of them are democracies, but some that are by no stretch of the imagination democracies still worry about China. And Vietnam being perhaps the most dramatic example. It is not coincidence that the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt, one reason they didn't head straight for port when the disease began to break out on the ship is that they were scheduled for a port visit in Vietnam. Somebody my age, the idea that the United States Navy is sending aircraft carriers into harbor in Vietnam. But we have very real allies. It is important, and I think would be a priority for a Biden administration to rebuild those relationships, to stop this silly attacks that the Japanese and the Koreans should pay all of the costs. there is a host nation support issue. There always has been. There will continue to be. But our big, I seriously do say that next to military power, and obviously our economic importance, the fact that we have real allies in the Asia-Pacific region, Indo-Asia Pacific region, as we now call it, is one of our big advantages. And it can be done. It takes effort.
We are now approaching 6 o'clock, but I know that, Walter, you agreed to stay on if we had...
Anybody wants to stay on. It's not dinner time for me. It's not even lunch.
No, so we'll continue for another half hour, and then we understand if you need to eat and have dinner, but there's still many more questions in the chat room, so we'll just continue. And to all others, thank you for attending. Yeah.
And obviously, if I may say so, I appreciate people coming. I assume many of you are eager to go off for dinner, but I'm glad to stay for almost, well, within reasonable minutes, as long as anybody has questions.
Okay, but then I'll continue with next question, which is from Lars Andersen. And it's about the Biden presidency. Is he likely to return to the Iran nuclear deal? Will the Biden presidency return to the nuclear deal with Iran? And he signed the Trump administration for a plan to resume nuclear talks with Iran, or pursue any other venue for negotiated settlement on the issues of the Iran deal?
Well, let me start with Biden. For various reasons, some substantive, some political, I would be surprised if there really is an option of simply telling Iran, all is forgiven, let's go back. Let's try to run the clock back. Maybe. Might be worth trying. I think it was a bad mistake to withdraw from the agreement. And indeed, another example of the price of American unilateralism, which we forfeited our biggest advantage in negotiation, which the JCPOA had the support not only of the American allies, but at least nominally of China and Russia. So I think there will almost certainly be some effort, some initiative to deal with Iran other than by maximum pressure, and to try to restore a common front with Europe. Part of the problem, of course, is that a fair amount of water has flowed under the bridge. Since withdrawal, the Iranians have been pretty straightforward about saying, okay, you don't want the deal, we'll go ahead and do things we're not allowed to do under the deal. So whether it can be put back together in exactly the same form is a good question. I think they certainly would try, just as the new administration might well have other arms control initiatives. As for the re-elected Trump, the administration's nominal position has been, there are real problems with this agreement. We are prepared to negotiate a better agreement, so let's negotiate. The Iranians, for reasons good, bad, and indifferent, have declined to do that in a serious way. Faced with 4 more years of a Trump administration, they might change their view. Iran is suffering from the sanctions. There are real pressures to get the sanctions off, what they got out of the deal. So it's even conceivable that there could be negotiations under a re-elected Trump administration. Not wildly optimistic about negotiations under a Biden administration, whether a Trump administration would do it or not. But remember, Trump has an immense capacity for reaching agreements which turn out not to mean anything. And he likes grand gestures. He's not the only president who likes grand gestures, but he likes grand gestures, and he might well put together a package that the mullahs would take.
Then a question from Peter Waldorf. You mentioned that the Democrats find that trade agreements inadequately addresses labor rights. Will the new USMCA agreement with new rules on enforcement change that?
Frankly, first of all, I don't hold myself out as a trade expert. It is certainly, it certainly has provisions which are designed to meet those concerns having to do with wage levels in Mexico and that. It is a small improvement on that. It is an improvement on NAFTA in that range as in others. The Democratic Party attitude, which is presumably Biden's, is friendship, support in principle, unlike Trump's position, which is opposition in principle, which can sometimes be overcome, but the Democratic side, support in principle for multilateral trading. Again, obviously, this is an issue in which China is a major factor. Although, remember, either administration is going to have to negotiate a post-Brexit deal with Britain. And there are trade issues between the EU and the States. I think the attitude in the Democratic Party, as I said, it's important to recognize that the Democratic Party has traditionally been the party in the last years, the party skeptical about trade because of the union base, mostly because of the union base of the party. And there's a lot of that still left, that there are large parts of the Democratic Party who regard too many multilateral trade agreements as too protective of American business interests and inadequately protective of the relative position of the American workforce as to other countries. And then similarly with respect to the environment, which is a much bigger issue. Many more environmentalists support more environmentalists support the Democratic Party. So you have an interesting political combination of working class union support and environmental support. And then, quite frankly, labor and environmental issues are important, but sometimes there's a simple element of protection in some of the policy trade agreements, especially about agriculture.
One of the things that has been sort of strange to me anyhow is the fact that, the lack of support for the World Trade Organization. And at the moment, it's really jeopardized. We're worried, will there be a World Trade Organization? And the fact that even under Obama, judges were not appointed for the World Trade Organization. So how do you see the World Trade Organization under Joe Biden and the need for sort of not only the bilateral trade agreements or multilateral trade agreements, but a more sort of overall regulation around trade?
I think the difference will be that the Democrats come to that issue with a sort of instinctive friendliness toward multilateral institutions. Same with the UN. So I think there will be an effort to restore its position. But it's also true, I think, that as I say, the Democratic Party they're not disciples of Adam Smith on trade. I think there is a growing recognition that trade is absolutely essential, and that virus issues have reminded us that, it's not just that we buy computers and electronic components from China. It's that China and India and other countries are major elements in the U.S. supply chain. Whether the United States would appoint, I assume the United States would appoint judges to the World Trade Organization, as that is part of the normal pattern of association. But that doesn't mean that issues with WTO go away simply because of Biden's president.
There's a question here from Michael Danielson about Taiwan. Would a Biden administration offer the same arms packages, F-16 airplanes and the new rules for visit of all levels of governments, or will it continue a more traditional cautious agenda towards Taiwan?
I'm a big friend and fan.
Yeah.
I think the Trump administration talked a great game on Taiwan, but actually not done very well. I think let's look at the Taiwan situation in a critical dimension, which is the relationship between Taiwan, between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. The Chinese have utterly bungled, reasons that were probably inevitable, but they have in fact bungled any hope of agreed unification between Taiwan under the one nation, two systems, by what they've done in Hong Kong. So that there are real pressures in Taiwan reflected in this election, where the DPP was supposed to lose dramatically. It was going to be virtually wiped out, won the election. And the DPP has real people in Taiwan who really support, they certainly support the de facto independence. De facto autonomy in many respects. And that, understandably perhaps, really annoys the Chinese. And the task for everybody in Beijing, in Taiwan, and in Washington, in my opinion, is to keep the status quo going. It has been a very good deal for Taiwan. It is, in fact, a good deal for China. And it's important for the United States. It's hard to explain to an American audience why, if there is a Chinese effort to take over Taiwan, the United States has to fight. I think it's much more likely that the crisis would take the form of some kind of coercion of Taiwan. And I certainly hope the United States would stand by Taiwan. Not only because of Taiwan, it's a democracy of like 30 million people. I guess the population is probably greater than the population of all the Nordic countries put together. It is one of the relatively few examples in Asia, Japan and Korea being the other ones, that has a real vibrant working democracy. It's very prosperous. It has all of the problems of a relatively high-wage country in Asia. It's a big success story, and the success has depended on not provoking the dragon and not giving in to the dragon. And I think the United States would continue to back that. On the specific issue, arms sales, I used to be one of the Pentagon negotiators on these. There's always a tension between what will really piss off the Chinese, what we think the Taiwan military armed forces need, and what the Taiwan government thinks they need. And there is a certain amount, I think it's better than it used to be, there is a certain amount of sell us this particular thing because it'll show you how much you love us. And it means we'll be spending a lot of money in the United States. As Taiwan's economic and fiscal situation has changed, the enthusiasm for spending money in the United States. But to some degree, these issues of exactly what kind of airplanes are they going to buy? Are they going to buy some submarines? Taiwan Navy actually uses a submarine which was in commission in the Second World War. Those issues sometimes have a military dimension and sometimes
Okay.
Political or economic.
Two last questions. One from Anders Kenny. Will there be a generational handoff to younger leaders, in especially the Democratic policy headed by Biden and Pelosi, who are pushing 80 and Schumer at 70 years old? Will there be a sort of a generational handoff within the I think the Democratic Party?
Inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean, my candidate was Pete Buttigieg, which skips 4 or 5 generations.
Yeah.
I think all of the people who ran, well, Sanders is also, well, for that matter, so is Trump, and meaning no disrespect for him as a human being, I wouldn't bet that his health at 71 or 72, whatever it is any better than Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But who's
90?
Oh, no, she's 83, 84.
Yeah.
Happily, she apparently is doing just fine. She's home. No, there will inevitably be a shift in the Congress, in the presidency. There have been stories even that Biden is toying with the idea of promising to be a one-term president. And that, among other things, makes his choice of a vice president immensely important. Because whoever he picks as vice president will almost inevitably be not necessarily a nominee in 2024 or 2028 if he does. But it means that the vice president, I can't do the numbers in my head, but since Truman, a great majority of the two people running for president in the successive elections, at least one has been a vice president.
Yeah.
And similarly in Congress, one of those deals where if you really know the players and can read the tea leaves, you have a pretty good idea of who the contenders will be. Who will win is a different issue. And the Democrats have got lots of young people. I think the bigger problem in terms of generational shift is whether the Republican Party will remain the kind of party that it is under Trump, or whether, particularly if they lose this election, there will be a transformation in the Republican Party, not only in generational terms, but in some sense in return to a more traditional Republican view.
Final question here from Denmark, Copenhagen. Will there be a special British-US relation after Brexit? Will this relationship be special?
Well, there will always be a U.S. special relationship with Britain. There really is a historical connection. There's a tradition of alliance and cooperation. On the other hand, Britain is only one could, you know, in some senses, a special relationship between the United States and Denmark. I mean, quite genuine. Or France, for that matter, for all the problems with French. I've always thought the reason the French can be so difficult about foreign policy is that, unlike a lot of other countries, they take it seriously. Yes, I think the big issue in the short term, of course, will be the bilateral trade agreement, in which, you know, Trump has made clear that he intends to drive a hard bargain. And for all the reasons I said about democratic perspectives on trade agreements, we won't give anything away for just because the British are wonderful and we stood by with them in World War II, and except from your point of view wisely, so that the relationship will hold. I think I should have mentioned this when I was talking about NATO. NATO will be somewhat different with Britain outside of the EU. It's hard to say in what ways, but there will be differences. Because, man, the British are always very big on this. We're the bridge between the United States and Europe. Well, they were a very different kind of bridge when they were in. I think the defense relationship, intelligence relationship, the relationship on nuclear weapons, that will almost certainly continue. In some ways, it's more likely to, except Johnson has such a huge majority, it's more likely to be questioned on the British side than the American, as one real weed to, as if Scotland were to become independent, the future of the British nuclear deterrent would be called into question. And that is a key.
Walter, thank you. Thank you for providing your perspective. I hope to see you in Copenhagen. But thank you so much. Thank you for giving us your insights, a perspective, and, you know, we'll keep a very keen eye on what's going to happen in the next half year in the US. And
well, I hope next year in Copenhagen.
Okay, thank you.
To take another Middle Eastern saying.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.